There is a moment just before everything changes when most people hesitate, not because they lack strength, not because they lack preparation, but because something inside them has not yet decided. And in that fraction of a second, the outcome is already determined, not by what happens next, but by what was never resolved. Miyamoto Musashi understood this. He understood it not as theory, not as philosophy read from a scroll, but as something carved into him through 60-plus duels, none of which he lost. He did not win because he was faster. He did not win because he was stronger. He won because by the time he arrived at the place of combat, the fight was already over inside him. What his opponents saw was a man. What they faced was something that had already moved beyond the need to survive. This video is about that principle. It is about what it means to win before the fight begins. And it is about something more relevant to your life than any sword ever drawn in feudal Japan. Because the fights you face every day are not fought with blades. They are fought with doubt, with distraction, with the slow erosion of the self that happens when a man has not decided who he is before the world demands an answer. In 1604, a young swordsman named Sasaki Kojiro stood at the shore of a small island called Gunryujima, waiting. He had arrived early, as was proper. He was considered by many to be the greatest swordsman in Japan, perhaps the greatest who had ever lived. His technique, the Tsubame Gaishi, the swallow counter, was said to be physically impossible to defend against. He carried a nodachi so long it had been given a name of its own, the drying pole. He was prepared. He was confident. He had every reason to believe that this day would be the day Miyamoto Musashi fell. Musashi arrived hours late. He arrived disheveled, having slept on the boat. He arrived carrying a wooden sword he had carved from his oar on the journey over. And when Sasaki Kojiro saw him step off that boat, something shifted in the air between them. Accounts from witnesses describe Kojiro as visibly disturbed. He shouted at Musashi for his lateness. He threw the scabbard of his sword into the sea in a gesture of contempt and confidence, a declaration that he would not need it again because the fight would end with Musashi's death. And Musashi, still unhurried, looked at him and said simply, "A man who throws away his scabbard has already decided he cannot go home." The duel lasted less than a moment. Musashi stepped forward and struck once. Kojiro fell. The greatest swordsman of his age died on that beach, and historians have argued for centuries about whether Musashi's lateness was strategy, arrogance, or indifference. But when you understand what Musashi believed about the nature of combat, the answer becomes clear. It was none of those things. It was simply the visible expression of an inner state that had been established long before the boat left shore. Musashi had already won. Kojiro's rage, his impatience, his thrown scabbard, these were not signs of confidence. They were signs of a man whose mind had already broken before the body had been touched. In Musashi's writings, particularly in the Gorin no Sho, the Book of Five Rings, he returns again and again to a concept that is difficult to translate but impossible to misunderstand once you have felt it. The concept is sen. It is sometimes translated as initiative, sometimes as preemption. But neither of those words captures what Musashi meant. Sen is not about moving first. It is about having already moved in your mind and spirit before the body acts. It is the understanding that combat begins not at the moment of first contact, but at the moment two people enter the same space and begin, consciously or not, to read each other. Musashi described three forms of senru ken no sen, the initiative of attack, in which you move so completely and with such total commitment that your opponent cannot respond. Tai no sen, the initiative of waiting, in which you allow the opponent to attack and you meet his force with such precise presence that his own energy destroys him. And Tai Tai no sen, the simultaneous initiative in which both minds move at once, and the outcome is determined entirely by which mind is more completely occupied, more fully present, more thoroughly committed to what it has already decided. In each form, the common thread is the same. The outcome is a product of what has been decided internally before the physical confrontation begins. This is not metaphor. Musashi was not speaking poetically about inner peace as a pleasant state to cultivate. He was describing a precise mechanical principle of how conflict actually works at the level of psychology and intent. When two people enter a confrontation, one of them is already operating from a resolved inner state and the other is not. The one who is still fighting an internal battle while engaging in an external one will always lose, regardless of physical capability, because a divided mind cannot execute with full precision, full commitment, or full presence. And Musashi's genius was not that he discovered this principle. His genius was that he built an entire life practice around achieving that resolved state before arriving at any moment that required it. Consider a man named Kenji. He is 34 years old. He works in a field that requires constant performance under pressure, negotiations, presentations, decisions made in rooms where other people are measuring him before he speaks. He is competent. He has prepared thoroughly for every meeting, every conversation, every situation that his career places him in. He knows his material. He knows the arguments. He has anticipated objections and prepared responses. By every visible measure, he is ready. And yet, consistently, something happens in the room that undoes him. Not catastrophically, not obviously, but there is a quality to his presence that others feel without being able to name. A faint hesitation in the delivery, a slight defensiveness in response to challenge, a readiness to concede that has nothing to do with the quality of his argument and everything to do with something unresolved in him that the other people in the room can sense before he opens his mouth. What Kenji does not realize is that his preparation has been entirely external. He has prepared his knowledge. He has prepared his arguments. He has not prepared his mind. Not in the way Musashi meant. He enters each room still carrying unresolved questions about his own worth, his own capability, his own right to occupy space with authority. And because those questions are unresolved, they become available to be exploited. Not consciously, not maliciously, but inevitably. Because every person in that room is also running their own internal calculations. And they can feel at a level below conscious awareness whether the person across from them has decided or is still deciding. This is the modern battlefield that Musashi's principles were made for, even though he never imagined it. The fights that matter most in a modern life are not physical. They are the negotiations you walk into having already conceded. They are the conversations you begin having already apologized internally for taking up space. They are the decisions you make from a place of wanting to be finished, rather than wanting to be right. They are the long, slow contests of will that happen in relationships, in careers, in the quiet struggle between who you are and who you are becoming, where the outcome is decided not in any single dramatic moment, but in the accumulated weight of every unresolved question you carried into every room for years at a time. Musashi used the word heiho to describe his approach to strategy and combat. It is often translated simply as strategy, but Musashi's use of the word carried a much broader meaning. For Musashi, heiho was not a set of tactics. It was a way of being, a total orientation of the self toward clarity, effectiveness, and the elimination of everything that interferes with direct perception and direct action. He wrote that the warrior who has mastered heiho sees things as they are, not as he fears them to be or as he hopes them to be. He acts from what is true rather than from what is comfortable. And this, Musashi argued, is the only source of genuine advantage in any confrontation with reality. The first principle of Musashi's Heiho is what he called Mitsu no Kokoroe, the knowledge of three things: knowing the way of the warrior, knowing the way of other crafts, and knowing the ways of all things. But beneath this is a more fundamental requirement that Musashi stated plainly in the opening pages of the Book of Five Rings. He said that a man must know himself completely, not the idealized version of himself, not the version he presents to others or the version he privately hopes he is. The actual self, with all its fears, its patterns, its unexamined beliefs about what is possible and what is not, what he deserves and what he does not. Until that knowledge is complete, or at least honestly pursued, all other preparation is built on a foundation that can shift at the worst possible moment. For Kenji, this realization did not come in a dramatic moment of insight. It came slowly, and it came through a practice he had initially dismissed as too simple to be useful. He began spending 30 minutes each morning in complete silence before his day began. Not meditation in any formal sense, not journaling. Simply sitting with himself without the buffer of screens, noise, or the constant forward momentum of tasks that usually filled every available space in his attention. And in that silence, he began to notice something. He began to notice the internal conversations he was having with people who were not in the room. The arguments he was pre-fighting, the criticisms he was pre-defending against, the apologies he was preparing before anyone had accused him of anything. He began to see that his mind was perpetually occupied in battles that existed entirely in his imagination, and that this occupation was consuming the very presence and clarity that he needed for the real encounters his life required of him. In the Zen tradition that deeply informed samurai practice and Musashi's own development, there is a state of mind called mushin. It is sometimes translated as empty mind or no mind, but these translations invite misunderstanding. Mushin is not blankness. It is not the absence of thought. It is the absence of obstruction. It is a mind that has no internal resistance to what is actually happening. A mind that perceives clearly, responds without the distortion of fear or desire, and acts from a place of complete presence rather than from the accumulated weight of past wounds and future anxieties. The samurai trained for mushin not as a goal in itself, but as a functional necessity, a mind cluttered with self-consciousness, with the fear of failure, with the desire to appear capable. Such a mind cannot process the moment it is in with the speed and clarity that survival requires. Every fraction of attention directed inward is attention that is not available for outward perception. And in a sword fight, as in any contest that matters, that fraction is the difference between life and death, between success and failure, between being the man who shapes the outcome and being the man to whom the outcome happens. Mushin was the state from which Zen became possible, because only a mind with no internal obstruction can commit fully to the present moment before the opponent has time to respond. For most people living ordinary modern lives, the obstacles to mushin are not exotic or unusual. They are the same obstacles they have carried for years, the unresolved grief that surfaces at unexpected moments, the childhood wound that turns reasonable criticism into an existential threat, the pattern of self-sabotage that activates precisely when things begin to go well, the deep-seated belief that visibility invites attack and that safety requires smallness. These are not weaknesses. They are simply unexamined obstructions, and the practice of removing them, slowly, honestly, without drama, is what Musashi meant when he described the way of the warrior as a lifetime of self-cultivation rather than a series of dramatic victories. Kenji's mornings of silence began to reveal his obstructions to him, not all at once, not in a way that felt like progress, in a way that felt initially like discovering how much he had been carrying without knowing it. He saw the way he had built his professional identity almost entirely on the need to appear competent rather than on the desire to do good work. He saw how his preparation for every important meeting was really a form of armor building, an attempt to make himself invulnerable to judgment rather than genuinely ready to engage. He saw that he had been fighting every day a war against his own visibility, and he saw that this war was the reason the rooms he entered already felt hostile before anyone in them had done anything. Musashi's daily life, as described in various accounts and in his own writings, was one of extraordinary discipline, but not the discipline of rigid routine for its own sake. It was the discipline of a man who had decided what mattered and had organized his life to reflect that decision completely. He did not own what he did not need. He did not pursue what distracted him from the way. He did not enter into relationships, obligations, or situations that divided his attention or compromised his clarity. His life was, in the most literal sense, the physical expression of a series of internal decisions that had been made completely and not revisited. This is what most people misunderstand about discipline. They treat it as the force required to do difficult things. And sometimes it is that. But at its deepest level, in the samurai tradition and in Musashi's life specifically, discipline is not force. It is the absence of internal debate. The disciplined man is not the man who forces himself to act rightly against his own resistance. He is the man who has decided so completely that resistance no longer arises, or when it arises as information rather than as opposition. He does not fight himself to maintain his practice. He has simply decided what his practice is, and everything else falls into place around that decision, in the same way that water finds its course after the channel has been dug. Kenji began making decisions in this spirit, not large dramatic decisions about his life's direction, but small specific decisions about who he was going to be in the contained territory of his daily experience. He decided that he would not apologize for occupying space with his perspective. He decided that he would not concede in advance to imagined opposition. He decided that when he prepared for an important conversation, he would spend as much time preparing his internal state as he spent preparing his arguments. Not by performing confidence, but by returning again and again to the question of what he actually believed and what he was actually there to say. These decisions were not comfortable. They did not produce immediate results, but they began slowly to change the quality of his presence in ways that others noticed before he did. Return for a moment to Musashi on the boat to Ganryujima. He had been invited to what was, by any measure, the most dangerous fight of his life, against a man who was arguably more technically gifted, certainly more formally trained, and who had the advantage of having arrived first, rested, and composed. By every conventional measure of preparation, Sasaki Kojiro had done everything right. Musashi had done almost nothing right. He had arrived late. He had slept. He was carrying a wooden sword he had made from an oar. And yet, what Musashi had that Kojiro did not was the product of decades of heiho, of the cultivation of a mind that had no unresolved business with the outcome of the day. Musashi had faced his own death so many times, in imagination and in reality, that it no longer occupied any space in his attention. He had no attachment to victory in the sense that Kojiro was attached to it, no identity that depended on the outcome, no fear that would compromise his execution, no self that needed protection from what was about to happen. He arrived at that beach as a man who had already settled every internal account. The fight for him was a formality. It was the external expression of something that had already been decided in the territory of the self. This is what it means to win before the fight begins. It does not mean certainty. It does not mean arrogance. It does not mean the elimination of risk or the guarantee of outcome. It means arriving at whatever demands your full self, with a self that has already been fully occupied by the question of who it is and what it is there to do. It means the elimination of the internal opponent, the voice of doubt, the weight of unresolved fear, the background noise of self-contradiction, before the external opponent has had the chance to find and use it against you. Musashi wrote near the end of his life that he had followed the way of strategy since his youth and had won 60 duels between the ages of 13 and 29. After that, he wrote, he spent the rest of his life in deeper study. He did not spend the decades after his victories resting on the reputation they had built him. He went further inward. He studied painting, sculpture, poetry, and metalwork, not because these things had obvious tactical value, but because each of them required the same quality of total presence and complete attention that distinguished a master from a capable practitioner. He was not building skills. He was refining a state of being. He was constructing, through every practice he undertook, a self that had fewer and fewer places left unexamined, fewer gaps where fear could enter, fewer unresolved questions that could distract him at the critical moment. The modern application of this is not difficult to understand, but is demanding to undertake. It requires a willingness to examine your own patterns with the same ruthlessness that a samurai would examine his technique, not to punish yourself for what you find, but to see it clearly and decide what to do about it. It requires the construction of small, consistent practices that build the quality of your internal state over time. In the same way that daily training builds physical capability, it requires the discipline to identify and remove the things in your daily life that divide your attention, compromise your presence, or keep you perpetually occupied in internal battles that leave you depleted before the external ones have begun. For Kenji, the change that his practice produced was not dramatic. There was no single meeting where he performed brilliantly and everything shifted. The change was subtler and more complete than that. Over months, he noticed that he was entering rooms differently, not with more confidence in the conventional sense, but with less internal noise. The apologetic pre-conversation was no longer running in the background. The defensive posture had softened, not because he had become less careful, but because he was less afraid of what carelessness might reveal. He had begun, in Musashi's terms, to know himself. And in knowing himself, he had reduced the territory available to be exploited by doubt, by pressure, by the scrutiny of people who had their own unresolved accounts to settle. There is a final lesson in the story of Ganryujima that is rarely discussed. When Sasaki Kojiro threw his scabbard into the sea, he believed he was making a statement of supreme confidence. He was declaring his certainty of victory so completely that he was willing to discard the instrument of his return. But Musashi saw it differently. To Musashi, the thrown scabbard was not a sign of strength. It was a sign of a man who had staked his identity so completely on the outcome of the next few minutes that he could no longer function outside of that outcome. Kojiro had made winning not just a desire, but a necessity. And necessity, in the psychology of combat, is the enemy of clarity. A man who must win cannot be fully present to what is actually happening, because part of him is perpetually in the future, monitoring the outcome, adjusting his identity to the possibility of failure, and consuming the attention that belongs entirely to the present moment. The samurai ideal was not indifference to outcome, in the sense of not caring what happened. It was indifference in the deeper sense of not requiring a particular outcome in order to remain fully oneself. The warrior who can lose without being diminished is more dangerous than the warrior who cannot afford to lose, because the warrior who cannot afford to lose is always fighting two battles simultaneously, the one in front of him and the one inside him. And as Musashi demonstrated on that beach, The man fighting two battles is already at a disadvantage against the man who has reduced his internal conflict to nothing. This is the final practice that Musashi's philosophy points toward, not the elimination of desire or ambition, not the cultivation of passivity or detachment from life, but the construction of a self so grounded in its own clarity and purpose that outcomes, while pursued fully, do not threaten it. A self that enters every fight, every difficult conversation, every demanding responsibility, every moment that requires the complete version of who you are, from a place of already knowing who it is and what it stands for, regardless of what the next hour brings. A man who has thrown nothing into the sea, a man who has kept everything that matters close, not because he fears losing it, but because he knows exactly what it is worth and exactly what it is for. When people study Musashi, they often focus on his victories. They count his duels. They memorize his principles. They seek the tactical insights that made him undefeatable and attempt to apply them to the conflicts of their own lives. And there is value in this. But what the counting of victories misses is the more important question. The question of what Musashi was doing in the years and decades between fights. What he was doing was building a self that did not need to be assembled in the moments before it was required. He was doing the quiet, continuous, unglamorous work of self-examination, self-cultivation, and the gradual elimination of every internal obstacle that could compromise his presence when presence was most needed. This is the preparation that cannot be seen. It happens in the silence before the day begins. It happens in the honest examination of why a particular kind of pressure affects you in a particular kind of way. It happens in the decision, made quietly and without announcement, to stop apologizing in advance for who you are. It happens in the practice of arriving fully in whatever moment you are in, without one part of you already negotiating your exit. It is slow. It is not visible to anyone else. It produces no immediate results that can be measured or displayed. And it is the only preparation that matters when the moment arrives that requires everything you have. Musashi did not win because he trained harder than other men, although he did. He did not win because he was more gifted than other men, although perhaps he was. He won because the man who arrived at each fight had fewer places in him that had not been examined, fewer unresolved conflicts consuming the attention that belonged entirely to what was in front of him. He won because he had done the work in private over years that most men avoid because it is quiet and uncomfortable and produces no applause. He won before the fight began, and the fight itself was simply the world catching up to a decision that had already been made. The work begins in silence. It begins now, and it has no end.